April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above occupied France. The morning sky was impossibly clear, a vast ocean of blue stretching across Europe like polished glass. High above the clouds, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermansen sat inside the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190A5, sunlight glinting off the canopy as he scanned the horizon. Then he saw them, heavy silhouettes clawing their way upward through the thin air. Slow, labored, awkward. A grin crept across the German pilot's face. "These are the Americans' new fighters," he muttered. Over the radio, laughter crackled from another Luftwaffe pilot. Hermansen pushed his oxygen mask aside just enough to speak clearly into the microphone. "Looks like the Americans have sent us flying milk bottles." More laughter followed. Below them, 16 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts struggled for altitude in tight formation. Their massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engines thundered against the sky, each aircraft dragging nearly 7 tons of armor, fuel, guns, and steel into combat. To the German pilots circling above, the aircraft looked absurd. The fuselages were enormous. The propellers looked oversized. The wings seemed too small for the aircraft carrying them. Compared to sleek Messerschmitt 109s and deadly Focke-Wulf 190s, the Thunderbolt appeared clumsy, almost comical. But what the Germans didn't know, what none of the experienced Luftwaffe veterans above France could possibly imagine, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the aircraft that would help destroy the German Air Force. Within 18 months, those flying milk bottles would transform into instruments of terror. The sound of 8 synchronized Browning .50 caliber machine guns would become one of the most feared noises in Europe. And hidden inside those broad wings was mathematics unlike anything the Luftwaffe had faced before. 3,400 rounds of ammunition, 6,000 rounds per minute, enough concentrated firepower to tear a fighter aircraft apart in under 2 seconds. The transformation began that very morning. Major Donald Blakesley, commander of the 335th Fighter Squadron, spotted the German fighters preparing to dive. Unlike many of the young American pilots around him, Blakesley already understood something vital. Survival inside AP-47 required abandoning everything pilots thought they knew about air combat. The Thunderbolt was not designed to fight like a Spitfire. It wasn't built to dance in tight turns like a Messerschmitt. Republic Aviation had created something entirely different, a high-altitude juggernaut, a flying battering ram built around brute force, engine power, survivability, and overwhelming firepower. Scattered across the skies over France, that day were pilots who would one day become legends, future aces, future war heroes, men whose names would later strike fear into German squadrons. But on April 8, 1943, they were simply inexperienced young pilots flying an untested machine against the most battle-hardened fighter force on Earth. The Germans had fought continuously since 1939. Poland, France, Britain, Russia. The Americans had been in combat for exactly 0 days. And yet, hidden beneath the awkward appearance of the Thunderbolt was a revolution in aerial warfare. The story of the P-47 began 3 years earlier during one of the darkest periods of the war. June 1940. France was collapsing. German armor rolled across Europe with terrifying speed while the Luftwaffe dominated the skies above the battlefield. Inside Republic Aviation, Chief Designer Alexander Kartveli received an urgent request from the United States Army Air Corps. America needed a fighter capable of matching the Luftwaffe at high altitude. What Kartveli designed shocked everyone. "It will be a dinosaur," he admitted to his engineering team, "but a dinosaur with good proportions." The XP-47B prototype that emerged from Republic's factory looked unlike anything the world had seen before. It was enormous. At nearly 10,000 pounds empty, it outweighed most existing fighters by an unbelievable margin. The turbo supercharger system, with massive ducting running through the fuselage, gave the aircraft a swollen appearance that made test pilots stare in disbelief. The first question nearly every pilot asked was the same. Does this thing actually fly? It did. And once airborne, it became something extraordinary. At its heart sat the Pratt & Whitney R 2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing over 2,000 horsepower. The engine was a monster, but the true secret of the Thunderbolt lay behind the cockpit, the turbo supercharger. Driven by exhaust gases, it allowed the aircraft to maintain full engine power at altitudes where German fighters began gasping for oxygen. At 27,000 feet, the P-47 still fought with the strength of an aircraft flying at sea level. That changed everything. Yet the Thunderbolt terrified many of the men forced to fly it. Major Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56 Fighter Group, initially hated the aircraft. Between September 1942 and January 1943, his unit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft during training alone. The P-47 killed more Americans in training than Germans in its early combat operations. It ground looped during landing. Torque rolled violently during takeoff. And when pilots pushed into steep dives, the aircraft accelerated so rapidly that shock waves froze the controls. Pilots discovered compressibility in combat because of the Thunderbolt. Some never recovered from those dives. But those who mastered the aircraft discovered something terrifying. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a quiet farm boy from Oklahoma who would later become one of America's greatest aces, described his first flight in the Thunderbolt years later. It felt like strapping yourself to a locomotive, he said. The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it. You aimed it. The first combat encounters over Europe seemed to confirm every German belief about the P-47. The Thunderbolt couldn't turn with a Focke-Wulf 190. It couldn't climb with a Messerschmitt 109 at lower altitude. It lacked the graceful agility of British Spitfires. German pilots quickly developed tactics to exploit its weaknesses. Attack from below, forced turning fights, dragged the heavy American fighters into low-altitude, maneuvering combat. There, the Thunderbolt seemed hopelessly outmatched. After his first encounter with a new American fighter, Luftwaffe ace Joseph Pips, Priller reportedly told fellow pilots, "The new American fighter is meat for slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow." The statistics initially supported German confidence. During their first month of combat operations, American Thunderbolt squadrons suffered significant losses, while claiming relatively few German aircraft in return. Even RAF Spitfire pilots quietly questioned the American decision to use a huge aircraft. British pilots joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was simply to unstrap yourself and run around the spacious cockpit. But something unusual was already happening, something German intelligence failed to notice. The P-47s being shot down absorbed astonishing levels of punishment before finally falling. Aircraft returned to England carrying damage that would have obliterated almost any other fighter in the world. 20 cannon holes, hundreds of machine gun strikes, shattered control surfaces, destroyed panels, and yet the aircraft kept flying. The massive radial engine proved incredibly resilient. Unlike liquid-cooled German engines, it lacked vulnerable coolant systems that could be destroyed by a single bullet. And when the Thunderbolt finally got its guns onto a target, the result shocked everyone. The 8-gun battery created a storm of destruction unlike anything most German pilots had ever experienced. Earlier fighters relied on rifle-caliber machine guns, or cannons carrying limited ammunition. The Thunderbolt carried enough ammunition to fire continuously for over 30 seconds. In aerial combat, that was eternity. Everything changed on June 26, 1943. Over France, Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson and his formation of 48 Thunderbolts were returning from escort duty when German fighters attacked from above. Focke-Wulf 190s from JG-26 dived out of the sun with devastating speed. Johnson's aircraft, flying near the rear of the formation, was caught in a deadly crossfire. Cannon shells exploded across the fuselage. The canopy shattered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed through the cockpit. Fire erupted behind the instrument panel. Shrapnel tore into Johnson's leg and nose. He attempted to bail out, but the canopy wouldn't open. A cannon shell had jammed the mechanism shut. He was trapped inside a dying aircraft at 27,000 feet, and then something extraordinary happened. Despite catastrophic damage, the Thunderbolt kept flying. Oil smeared across the windscreen, blinding Robert Johnson almost completely. The engine shook violently in front of him, like it was moments from tearing itself apart. Warning lights flashed across the cockpit. Smoke curled around his face. Every breath tasted of burning metal and hydraulic fluid. Any other fighter in Europe would already have fallen from the sky in pieces. But the Thunderbolt kept moving. Barely responsive and bleeding fuel across the freezing air, Johnson managed to level the aircraft and point its shattered nose towards England. Then he saw another shape approaching through the smoke. A lone Focke-Wulf 190. The German fighter slid into position behind the crippled P-47 like a wolf stalking wounded prey. The pilot lining up on Johnson had no idea he was about to witness something almost unbelievable. At less than 170 miles per hour, Johnson's Thunderbolt limped towards the channel. It could barely stay airborne. The German pilot opened fire. 20mm cannon shells slammed into the aircraft. Heavy machine gun rounds ripped through the fuselage. Johnson could do nothing except crouch behind the armor plate and wait to die. The Thunderbolt absorbed the entire attack. Still it flew. The German fighter pulled away, repositioned, and attacked again. More cannon fire. More explosions. More strikes tearing chunks from the American aircraft. Still the Thunderbolt refused to fall. Now confused, the German pilot moved alongside the damaged fighter. For a moment, the two men stared directly at one another through shattered canopies. Johnson later remembered seeing the pilot's expression change completely. Confidence, confusion, then disbelief. The German pilot attacked a third time, emptying his remaining machine gun ammunition into the Thunderbolt's fuselage. Nothing happened. The P-47 kept flying. Finally, with no ammunition left, the German pilot eased alongside one last time. He shook his head slowly, raised a hand in a brief salute, and disappeared into clouds. Robert Johnson somehow landed the ruined Thunderbolt back in England. Ground crews stopped counting bullet holes after reaching 200. Entire sections of the aircraft had been ripped apart. 3 of the main structural supports were nearly severed. The engine had taken direct hits. Control cables hung by threads. One shell had exploded inches from Johnson's head. Another detonated against the armor behind his seat. Yet somehow impossibly, the aircraft had carried him home. The story spread rapidly across both air forces. American engineers studying the wreckage realized something extraordinary. Even they had underestimated the Thunderbolt. German intelligence officers initially refused to believe the reports. No aircraft should have survived that level of punishment. But too many pilots had witnessed it. The impossible was real. The massive American fighter could absorb devastating damage and still keep fighting. And by the summer of 1943, American pilots were finally beginning to understand how to use the Thunderbolt properly. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke became one of the first commanders to unlock the aircraft's true potential. His instructions were brutally simple. Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them at low altitude. Use your weight. Use your speed. Use your guns. The Thunderbolt's greatest weakness, its enormous weight, suddenly became its deadliest weapon. In a dive, nothing in the Luftwaffe inventory could catch it. From high altitude, the P-47 accelerated like a falling artillery shell. At full dive speed, it could exceed 550 miles per hour, faster than many German fighters could safely endure. American pilots soon developed a new style of combat. Climb high above the enemy. Dive with overwhelming speed. Fire one devastating burst. Then climb back into the heavens before the Germans could react. The tactic became known as boom and zoom. German pilots soon gave it another name, execution from above. Thunderbolt formations climbed higher and higher into the stratosphere, often above 30,000 feet, where German fighters struggled to operate effectively. When Luftwaffe aircraft appeared below, the P-47s rolled inverted and plunged downwards like thunderbolts from the gods. At those speeds, deflection shooting became nearly impossible for German pilots. And when the 8 Browning machine guns opened fire, aircraft simply ceased to exist. German survivors described facing a wall of steel, a storm of heavy caliber bullets tearing through aircraft structures with horrifying violence. Wings ripped away, engines exploded, cockpits vanished in clouds of fire and debris. One German pilot later said, "It was not like being attacked by fighters. It was like flying into industrial machinery." The true scale of American firepower became undeniable during the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids in August 1943, the deepest Allied penetration into Germany so far attempted. Thunderbolt squadrons escorted bombers into the heart of the Reich, while waves of German fighters attacked relentlessly. Major David Schilling led a flight of P-47s against a formation of Messerschmitt 110 destroyers, preparing to strike American bombers with rockets and heavy cannon. The German twin-engine aircraft were heavily armed bomber killers, deadly against B-17s, but vulnerable against fast fighters. Schilling's Thunderbolts attacked from 28,000 feet. They fell upon the German formation with terrifying speed. One surviving German gunner later described the attack during interrogation. "The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven. I fired at one and saw my round strike its wing. It did not even wobble. Then they opened fire. The aircraft ahead of us did not crash. It disintegrated. In seconds, there was nothing left." The concentrated firepower of the P-47 shocked the Luftwaffe. Each aircraft carried 425 rounds per gun. At convergence range, all 8 streams of fire merged into a killing zone only a few feet wide. Anything caught inside it faced over 100 heavy caliber projectiles every second. And unlike German cannons, the Americans could keep firing. German pilots often carried limited ammunition for their 20mm cannons, sometimes less than 120 rounds. Thunderbolt pilots could unleash sustained streams of destruction for half a minute. The ammunition itself reflected America's industrial might. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds, tracer rounds, explosive ammunition patterns designed not only to destroy enemy aircraft, but ignite them. Top American ace Francis Gabreski later described the effect bluntly. When all 8 guns hit something, he said, "It didn't go down, it exploded." By late 1943, German pilots began discovering another terrifying reality about the Thunderbolt. The higher the battle climbed, the stronger the P-47 became. Its turbo-supercharged engine maintained full power above 30,000 feet, while German aircraft gradually lost performance in thin air. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs became sluggish and slow at extreme altitude. The Thunderbolt remained powerful, fast, deadly. On October 8, 1943, one of Germany's greatest aces encountered that reality firsthand. Hans Philipp had over 200 victories. He had survived hundreds of combat missions across Europe and the Eastern Front. He was among the Luftwaffe's elite. That morning, Philipp led German fighters against American bombers flying high above Bremen. But at nearly 6 miles above Earth, his Focke-Wulf struggled in the thin atmosphere. Then Thunderbolts of the 56th Fighter Group descended from even higher altitude. Robert Johnson, now a seasoned combat pilot, spotted Phillips' aircraft below him. The attack lasted seconds. Johnson opened fire from roughly 300 yards. Heavy rounds tore across the German fighter from nose to tail. The aircraft exploded violently. No parachute appeared. The death of Hans Philipp shocked the Luftwaffe. If one of Germany's finest pilots could be destroyed so quickly by the Thunderbolt, what chance did ordinary pilots have? German High Command demanded detailed analysis of the American fighter. The resulting report alarmed even Hermann Göring himself. The P-47 could fight above 40,000 feet. Its dive speed approached the sound barrier. Its armor protection far exceeded most European fighters. And perhaps worst of all, its construction allowed it to survive damage that would destroy multiple conventional aircraft. Then, in early 1944, the Thunderbolt became even more dangerous. A new version arrived in England fitted with a massive paddle blade propeller. The improvement was immediate. Earlier P-47s had climbed poorly. Now the Thunderbolt surged upward with terrifying power. Climb rates increased dramatically. Acceleration improved. Energy retention became exceptional. Suddenly, the huge American fighter could compete directly with German aircraft even during climbs. German pilots quickly noticed a difference. One Luftwaffe veteran wrote in his combat diary, "The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We attacked expecting an easy advantage. Instead, they climbed with us. When Schmidt tried to escape, they followed him upwards. They destroyed him instantly. These are not the same aircraft we laughed at last year." By early 1944, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer a joke in the skies over Europe. It had become a predator. The same German pilots who once mocked the giant American fighter now reacted with fear the moment they heard the deep thunder of its engine approaching through the clouds. The new paddle blade propeller transformed the aircraft completely. The Thunderbolt climbed faster, accelerated harder, and retained energy in combat with terrifying efficiency. Combined with immense firepower, the P-47 had evolved into one of the deadliest machines of the war. And now, it could escort bombers deep into Germany. With external fuel tanks mounted beneath its wings, the Thunderbolt's range expanded dramatically. American formations now accompany B-17 flying fortresses directly into the heart of the Reich, where the Luftwaffe launched desperate interception attacks. German pilots soon discovered the nightmare waiting for them. To reach the bombers, they first had to survive the Thunderbolt escort screen. Many never did. Again and again, P-47 squadrons descended from high altitude with overwhelming speed, smashing through German formations before they could properly react. Luftwaffe veterans described the attacks as ambushes delivered by steel giants falling from the stratosphere. One German ace later recalled, "We saw them above us against the sun. Someone laughed and called them flying pigs. Nobody laughed 30 seconds later. They came down like an avalanche. Their guns did not fire bursts. They poured out streams of death. When you were caught in that stream, you disappeared." The effect on German aircraft was horrifying. Fighters struck by concentrated .50 caliber fire often didn't simply crash. They exploded apart in midair. Wings tore free. Engines ripped loose. Entire fuselages disintegrated under the impact of hundreds of heavy rounds smashing through aluminium and fuel tanks. And unlike German cannon systems, the Thunderbolt's guns almost never jammed. The aircraft could absorb punishment. The pilots were increasingly experienced, and America's factories kept producing more. By spring 1944, the Luftwaffe faced an enemy unlike anything it had prepared for. The P-47 represented American industrial warfare at its most terrifying: mass production, massive firepower, massive endurance, massive pilot training programs. Germany simply could not compete. Then came D-Day. June 6, 1944, the invasion of Normandy. More than 500 P-47 Thunderbolts filled the skies above the beaches of France, creating a shield of steel over Allied troops landing below. German aircraft attempting to reach the coastline found Thunderbolts waiting at every altitude. One Luftwaffe pilot described the invasion sky as hopeless. You could not climb over them. You could not die beneath them. The sky belonged entirely to the Americans. The Thunderbolt's role now expanded beyond air superiority. It became an executioner on the ground. Loaded with bombs, rockets, and thousands of rounds of ammunition, P-47s began hunting German convoys, armor, trains, and troop movements across occupied Europe. The aircraft's 8 Browning machine guns proved devastating against vehicles. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through trucks, locomotives, fuel carriers, and even the thinner armored tanks from above. Entire German columns vanished beneath Thunderbolt attacks. Pilots dived low across roads and railway lines, unleashing torrent of fire that shredded anything moving below. German soldiers soon developed a terror of Allied fighter bombers they called J-bows. But even among J-bows, the Thunderbolt became infamous. Its huge radial engine roared like distant thunder before attacks. Then came the rockets, then the bombs, then the hammering sound of 8 machine guns ripping the earth apart. One German officer later described a Thunderbolt strike during the Normandy campaign. A column of 20 vehicles simply ceased to exist. In seconds, the road became fire. The men were terrified beyond reason. They believed the aircraft could see everything. Throughout the summer of 1944, P-47 systematically destroyed German mobility across France. Locomotives, railway cars, fuel depots, tanks, bridges, supply convoys. Nothing was safe in daylight anymore. The Luftwaffe tried desperately to resist, but the balance of power had already collapsed. Experienced German pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages crippled training programs. New pilots entered combat with barely enough experience to survive basic maneuvers. Meanwhile, American pilots arrived with hundreds of training hours, advanced gunnery practice, formation training, and aircraft produced in numbers Germany could scarcely comprehend. At peak production, Republic Aviation completed nearly 1 Thunderbolt every hour. Over 15,000 P-47s would eventually be built. The factories never stopped, and the Thunderbolt kept evolving. In the Pacific, the aircraft proved equally deadly against Japanese fighters. The P-47's durability and firepower became overwhelming advantages. Japanese pilots accustomed to fragile dogfights suddenly faced an aircraft that refused to burn, refused to break apart, and answered every attack with devastating streams of heavy caliber fire. One Japanese ace later admitted, "We called them monsters. Our cannon seemed useless against them, but their bullets tore aircraft apart instantly." By late 1944, Thunderbolts were even engaging Germany's revolutionary jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262. The jets were faster, far faster, but they were vulnerable during takeoff, landing, and low-speed attack runs. Thunderbolt pilots learned quickly. From high altitude, P-47s dived at terrifying speed, sometimes approaching 500 miles per hour, under the concentrated fire of 8 Browning machine guns. Even advanced jet aircraft disintegrated like conventional fighters. One American pilot reported watching a Me-262 literally come apart in midair after a single firing pass. By 1945, specialized P-47 variants equipped with water methanol injection pushed performance even further. These final Thunderbolts became some of the fastest piston engine fighters of the war. But by then, the Luftwaffe was already dying. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Airfields lay in ruins. Experienced veterans were gone. Young German pilots entered combat knowing survival was unlikely. Many flew only a single mission before being killed. And always, above them, waited the Thunderbolts. The psychological effect became devastating. German troops feared the sound of approaching P-47s so deeply that military doctors observed symptoms of panic and trauma whenever Thunderbolts were reported nearby. Veteran soldiers who had survived years of war threw themselves into ditches at the distant rumble of radial engines because they knew what followed: rockets, bombs, and the mechanical roar of 8 machine guns. When the war finally ended, the numbers were staggering. Thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed, tens of thousands of vehicles annihilated, millions upon millions of rounds fired, entire transport systems paralyzed. The Thunderbolt had not merely participated in the destruction of the Luftwaffe. It had helped erase it from the sky. And perhaps most remarkable of all, the aircraft that accomplished this entered combat as a laughingstock. German pilots had mocked its size, its weight, its appearance. They believed Americans did not understand aerial warfare. But the Americans had understood something far more important. Wars are not won by elegance. They are won by endurance, by production, by survivability, by overwhelming force. The P-47 Thunderbolt embodied all of it. A flying fortress disguised as a fighter. A machine built not merely to win battles, but to outlast entire nations. Years after the war, former German pilots admitted the truth openly. They had underestimated the Thunderbolt completely. One Luftwaffe veteran summarized it best during a reunion decades later. "We laughed when we first saw them. Fat American fighters that could not turn, could not climb, could not fight. But then we realized something terrifying. They did not need to turn. They did not need to climb. They only needed to point those guns at you. And suddenly, you no longer existed." The laughter vanished from the skies of Europe long before the war ended, because by 1945, there are almost no German pilots left alive to laugh at the Thunderbolt anymore.